Aloha kakayaka e Hawaii. This is Pokalai Nui. You are listening to Hawaiian Potpourri. Welcome to the program. Last night we had a discussion on a number of issues. The primary issue dealt with what is happening in the international arena and especially in the Middle East with regards to the Libyan American embassy in Libya and the killings there, and now over 20 countries in that region finding protest against the United States. It's a sort of a generalized protest, and the reasons why this is happening. That discussion led to the subject of the collapse of the American empire, and we discussed when this collapse would occur. Some people have said, and Johan Galtung has said, as far as 2025 or as close as 2025. Moving his assessment up, especially during the George Bush era, by 5 years, and I suppose he would probably move it up with the Obama administration a few more years to show the collapse. And I think his assessment is pretty much on target. 10 years prior to the Soviet Union's collapse, he had predicted the precise year in which the Soviet Union would eventually hit the ground, I guess you could call it. Another caller last night said he predicted 2 years and the U.S. would collapse. I would suggest that the U.S. is in collapse at the present time. As we look around, we find the collapse occurring. And I don't think it's a sudden movement to collapse. I think for empires, it's a gradual process in which finally you turn around and find that it's not an empire anymore, and that the behavior of this former empire needs to change. Johan Galtung suggests that actually the United States will be a better country after the collapse, because it will learn how to be a country like other countries, and it will be a much better neighbor. It'll get rid of this impression that it is an exceptionalist country able to ignore international law and other international rules for behavior with others. At the present time, it continues to commit these atrocities, violations of international law, not only embargoing other countries, preventing third-party countries from even trading with these countries, and at times putting up a fleet of ships to stop countries from moving, or other fleets or other ships from moving back and forth into different areas. It is now involved in the Strait of Hormuz. It goes off into the China Sea and pretends that it sort of is the owner of the world's commons, these areas that should belong to everyone. And so there's been a lot of that exceptionalist actions, especially during the George Bush #2 era, and now even under the Obama era, especially now with the Obama era, the drone flights, the violation of human rights, the torture that goes on, and yet they have the audacity to go out and preach to others on why human rights should be respected. So there's a lot of that hypocrisy that has been going on both under the Obama administration as well as the George Bush administration. I think the most thankful thing we have to say during this period of time, that it's to be thankful that it's not a Republican in the White House anymore, because if it was, it would be even worse than a Democrat in terms of international affairs. So I think as we look at what is happening in the United States, there is that very strict dichotomy. I think the Democrats are responding appropriately to the internal issues or the domestic issues within the United States. As it deals with the external issues or the international issues, they are just as atrocious as the Republicans have been. However, when it deals with civil rights and human rights, even in the domestic affairs, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been walking all over some of these very basic fundamental freedoms and human rights. The freedom not to be tortured, the freedom to not to be jailed unless appropriately charged, and so many other things. And what they're doing with, as an example, Bradley Manning is a complete violation of human rights that the United States has previously supported with its National First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired that committee on the development of human rights standards, so that she came out with, and not only her but many others, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And today the United States consistently violate that Universal Declaration. And of course, if you wanted to go all the way back, you can go back to over 100 years here in Hawaii, when the United States committed that first attempt at regime change, changing the political regime, which was led by Queen Liliuokalani, and have never returned or restored that that crime committed by the United States. So it's something that has been continuous, but it has been even worse over the more recent years. So that's the discussion we had, and from that discussion we eventually closed last night's discussion with my ranting about both the Republican National Convention and the Democrat National Convention was more a play for the public audience in terms of opening campaign shots across the party lines as to whose candidate would be the better president. But when it really came down to a discussion of issues, a debate of these values, it was not there. Where was the debate with regards to international affairs, with regards to the whole idea of invasion into other countries? Where was a debate with regards to going after these international criminals, although they are high officials, such as George Bush, such as Dick Cheney, such as Colin Powell, such as Condoleezza Rice, and there are many others who participated in the what do you call it, conspiracy to commit these international crimes, both against other countries as well as internally, by the sucking away of fundamental freedoms, all under the guise of protecting the national security, under the guise of a new war and another endless war, the war against terrorism, which is a switch in terms of warfare, in terms of declaration of war. Previous to that, another endless war against drugs and alcohol. The enemy in those wars essentially breed from the United States itself, but by converting it and turning it into a foreign enemy, then they get away with increasing the military budget, increasing the political budget, and escape the oversight of these questions that, as I said before, should have been debated in these national conventions. Okay. And finally, as we see the collapse of this American empire, and as we see the deterioration of our societies into this mindlessness or this lack of direction, and before it gets so bad that we have protests in the streets without any direction, one of our callers suggested that, well, perhaps it's time that we started developing leadership. And developing leadership is fine, but how do you develop that leadership? And it is not based on a person who has a nice personality, can speak well, who looks good, who has what people call a charisma, but not really being appropriately informed and haven't gone through an appropriate analysis of what his foundation is, what his belief system is. So rather than the development of leadership, more the development of certain core principles. and that is the introduction of what Michael had talked about, the development of a statement of envisioning Hawaii's future and what that kind of society should be built upon. Perhaps using that as an ability to expand even beyond Hawaii and contributing to the discussion for other societies to take a look at what is the deep values of their society. Where do they want to go with the deep values? How do you envision new changes within the system that control these deep values? So he suggested that we should be ready to post a draft statement of these deep values, and so I will be posting it this coming week, or this week in fact. Today is Sunday, and we'll be posting it on my website, and it's at hawaiianperspectives.org. The document isn't there yet, but we'll post a draft of it and use that as a foundation for further discussions, whether it's on this radio show or we'll be conducting meetings out in the general public so that people can come and discuss and try to refine these drafts, or this draft. And I'll be announcing that as we go further into our programs as the week passes by. Okay, so that's a summary of what we had been talking about last night, and I know it's a mouthful, and I missed out on some of it because there was so much discussion going on that I am not able to capture all of the details that was brought up. The way we operate this program is, if you do have an opinion on some of these matters, you are welcome to call. Our telephone number here is 524-1080, and we'll take your telephone calls and invite you to share your opinion with us, and perhaps we can engage in a discussion over that opinion or other matters that may come to mind. Okay, again, the telephone number is 524-1080. Now, I just opened this morning's newspaper, and looking through the week's newspaper, there were other matters that would be appropriate. I shouldn't call it fodder, but appropriate issues for discussion. One of the matters that was raised in Star Advertiser this morning, and by the way, today is in fact the 16th day of September in the year 2012. So the discussion in the Star Advertiser's front page is the excessive 9/11 calls and how they add up very quickly. One of the callers for these 9/11 ambulance assistance called 142 times over a period of 12 months, and that was in the last year that this individual was alive, and he was a homeless individual. No, he did not suffer from mental illness. He did not suffer from alcoholism. He had multiple medical problems, and his age was 55. He died last year, but over that period of his calls, he called 142 times for the ambulance. The top 10 callers average 50 times a year for the need for ambulance. How much does it really cost for an ambulance trip? The average cost is $795, let's say $800, and oftentimes these costs are paid for by some kind of public insurance companies or plans, such as Medicaid, Medicare, or it may, I'm not sure what other plans there may be for these kinds of high billing. But anyway, this is what has been happening. Of the number of people who have been making such calls, there's two who, of the number of the top 10 who have been making such calls that average, as I said, 50 a year, two of the top 10 are not homeless. 8 of the 10 have been homeless. What about mental illness? And are the majority mentally ill? The answer is no. Only 1 out of 10 are seriously mentally ill, or at least mentally ill, and 9 out of the 10 are not. And yet they are still making these calls. So this is a very large issue that needs to be addressed, and you can imagine the cost to the city every time they send out an ambulance. But with the top 10 at an average of 50 a year, that comes out to, what is it, 500 calls, 500 ambulance calls at $800 call, 8 times, that's 40. Okay, so that's, what is it, $40,000 or about there, just to service the top 10. I wonder if I have the right zeros to it. So that would be, let me figure it out again. All right, $800, average 50 a year, and if it's 10 of them, that's 500 times $800, and so we have a lot of zeros there, don't we? I think it's no, it's probably $400,000. Yeah, I think that's closer to it. Just to service 10 people. What we have said is that to cut down on this, when we who deal with the issue of mental health, and we have found to a certain extent that it is just a few people, let's say 5% of the total population that uses the emergency services, whether it's in the emergency room or use of the ambulance service. And so if you provide integrated service of taking a look at a person's primary health needs as well as the mental health needs, and integrate it rather than truncate the service and say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't handle this, you have to see another type of doctor, or you have to go to another specialist. And as a result of that, the cost for emergency uses increase. Okay, anyway, I won't get any further into that unless someone calls and would like to discuss or share a contrary opinion or a similar opinion on that matter. Every once in a while, I read through Flashback by David Shapiro, and I think he has a good memory, and being able to look at history and what is coming at us now, it can be interesting. What he writes about is Abercrombie is seething as state gets suckered again. Let's see what he talks about. He says Governor Neil Abercrombie said he should pay no attention to critics of the controversial Public Land Development Corporation, calling them, quote, the usual suspects who vilify my directors and try to demoralize people. Funny, that's what Governor John A. Burns used to say about him. Well done, David. Going on, he says, detractors press their complaint that loose bidding requirements in the PLDC's proposed rules for widespread development of state lands could result in favoritism and bloated contracts. In other words, it's modeled after the Oahu Rail Project. Something we haven't heard for a few weeks, have we? Okay, Abercrombie says he wants to hear Kauai's concerns at his first governor's cabinet in your community event this week in Lihue. Guarded Islanders will get to see the governor's nifty trick of listening with his lips moving. All right. The state paid, on a different matter, the state paid $400,000 in workers' compensation benefits to a former Kauai man who has been dead for 20 years. And $80,000 more to a Big Island man who died 2 years ago. The rule of thumb that you can't take it with you, like most common sense, doesn't apply to our state government. Okay. Well, was this really a state case, the state workers' compensation payment out, or was it the city and county who was paying out these amounts? You know, the city runs its own workers' comp organization, and so city employees would also have the same thing. Private employees can be either paying directly from their own coffers if they are what we call self-insured, or they could be paying out through insurance companies or private insurance companies. But in this case, in the $400,000 case, a woman who was caring for her father who died, and he died in California, and she falsified her records so that annually when workers' comp checks to see that a person is still alive, she falsified and said that yes, he was, and so checks kept going to his trust account at a bank in which she appears to have been the trustee, and she kept collecting the money. She has subsequently been charged for mail fraud and some other things. So there's that thing going on in that case. I'm not familiar with the Big Island case. All right. Again, I say, if you would like to call and share an opinion on any of these matters, our telephone number is 524-1080.
Kaulana na pua o Hawaii, Kupa ama hope o ka aina, Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino, Pala pala anunu me ka paka. Pane mai Hawaii moku o ke ave, Koku ana honoa o Pilani, Ka ko'o mai kaua I o mano, Pa'apu me ke oni o ka kuhi hewa. Aolea e kau I ka pulima, Maluna o ka pepa o ka enemi, Po'ohui ai nā ku ai hewa, I ka pono sivila a o ke kana